Welcome back to the Autoblog Podcast. I'm Greg Migliore. We've got a great show for you today. We're going to talk about the Scout that's coming back from VW, the Chevy Blazer Ss, and Tesla. The Semi is finally making its way towards us. Got some interesting things that we've been driving, including the Cadillac Escalade in diesel variant. I enjoyed that. I had that for over a week. The diesel, the new Duramax, is it's a lot of fun. We also have the EV6 versus, I don't know if we're going to quite put them head to head, the Hyundai Ioniq 5. And we also will talk about this. Maybe I've buried the lead here a little bit, but the Nissan Z. With that, I will bring in Associate Editor Byron Hurd and News Editor Joel Stocksdale. Guys, how are we?
Pretty good, pretty good. Just coming off an interesting week of pleasant spring Detroit weather, and now we're back to not so pleasant Detroit spring weather.
That sounds right.
Yep, pretty much the same over here.
Yeah, I've decided to relocate to my upstairs office with the heat on, which is a lot different than earlier this week when I was working from the sunroom with the windows open and the beautiful 70-degree air wafting in. Much, much different times. And it'll be warm this weekend. It's going to be 92 on Friday. But you probably don't download this podcast for the Metro Detroit Weather Report. Let's talk about some cars. One thing I forgot to mention off the top, Road Test Editor Zach Palmer is driving the Acura Integra this week. He will give us a dispatch from the field. So stay tuned for that at the end of the show. Going to be a lot of fun. Let's break down some of these news items, though. The Scout. The Scout is coming back. This is a name that's been gone for quite some time, since the early 80s. I actually heard somebody compare it to the USFL, which is the United States Football League, which I love sports. Even I forgot that was a thing. So you've got to be pretty old to remember that. You've also got to be fairly old to remember the Scout, as in like real life experience of it. But I think it could be a good move coming back. Kick it over to you, Byron. What do you think of this move?
I think it's a good idea. It's also an interesting way to kind of segregate Volkswagen's EV stuff from its quote-unquote legacy ICE trains. So you got a good way to kind of like push this new quote-unquote brand as an electric-only type thing, while leaving Volkswagen to kind of, work its transition, continue building ICE as long as it has to before the end of the decade transitions everyone's promising. And honestly, even for the people who don't recognize the Scout, I'm sure a lot of people will recognize it as, hey, isn't that an old Bronco? Oh, wait, no, it's not. So, people have seen these. They know what they are, even if they don't know what they are, because a lot of them are still kicking. And even here in the Midwest, you see Scouts and old Travelalls and stuff like that from International. They're hiding in garages, but they're here.
That's a really good way to put it. It kind of looks like a Bronco. And then you look at it and you're like, that's not it. But, oh, wait, I think I've heard of that. Okay. Pretty, I think it's definitely a good design, even if it's perhaps not super familiar to everyone. It's maybe more familiar than they think, I guess. Joel, how do you feel about this?
Well, it could be really cool. It could also be a huge whiff. It all depends on. I mean, I give it a 50, kind of like a 50-50 shot either way, because VW has proven in the past that they can actually make a pretty solid off-roader and some kind of interesting sort of truck-like vehicles. The Volkswagen Touareg is kind of my go-to reference for that, because that ended up being an impressively capable SUV, the first generation one, and kind of proved that VW can actually do an SUV. And I mean, they've got years of off-road racing experience. And also VW has loads of EV experience at this point too. So those are some things that are definitely in the positive for them, but I think they could probably pull it off. On the other hand, I don't know about VW and their ability to relaunch a brand in the US, especially one that hasn't really been something that people know about for decades and decades. I mean, even the Bronco survived into the 90s, and the Blazer even longer than that. And both of them always probably, I'm fairly certain, outsold the Scout. You also have the issue of the people that do remember what IH Scouts were are going to be diehards, and if it doesn't live up to their expectations, they're not going to be into it. They're not going to talk it up. And I feel like that could potentially hurt like regular customer sales. Especially when you've got a lot of alternatives either already on sale or coming out. You've got the new Bronco, you've got the Wrangler, you've got the Hummer EV, you've got Rivians, and honestly, Rivian's designs I feel have a real element of IH Scout in them, kind of this clean, boxy shape. And you know, Volkswagen has a history of just kind of missing the mark when it comes to anything sort of targeted at the U.S. I don't know. I don't know if it's a case of Volkswagen Global kind of comes in and decides for Volkswagen Group America what America wants and ends up and just doesn't understand, and maybe VW Group America needs a little bit more autonomy. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. So I could see this going great. I could see it going terribly. Yeah, I do think it'll be interesting. I think the sketches look promising, and I mean SUVs and trucks are popular, so yeah, I can see it going both ways easily.
In its favor, I definitely think Volkswagen has the technological and design chops to do this right. It was a very cool vehicle in its time, and I think the looks have held up in a very, timeless manner. The part where I get a little I have questions, let me put it that way, is they're trying to frame this as a Scout brand. That's the verbiage I've seen in our stories and other sites, the way they're sort of framing this. The Scout brand wasn't really a brand. It was really more of a model line in the 70s into the early 80s under the International Harvester line. So to try to make it like its own thing, I feel like that might be more aggressive. It could be a bigger risk. Now, the reward could be better, though, is if they start saying, hey, this is a Scout, and then they maybe use a little more specific designations for what looks to be like a truck kind of model, and then more of an SUV style, and then they, separate them even further. That could work, the Scout truck, the Scout, whatever, however, if they go with old names or bring something back, sure, it could work, but it's definitely more of it's broader, it's almost like when, GMC brought the Hummer back, but they said, yeah, it's still going to be a GMC per se. And it's going to be at GMC stores, and it does have GMC badging on it somewhere. Everybody will, of course, call it a Hummer, that type of thing, but it's not going to, it doesn't have to stand on its own. To further, dig into this, though, VW has a ton of money. If they want to spend it on marketing to launch a new brand in the US, they certainly can. So, the big takeaway for me is that it could be another cool SUV that's electric that has sort of a retro design. Cynically, though, the other side of this, where I think you're going, Joel, is this could also be the first one that doesn't quite catch on. It feels like a lot of these retro things, like the Bronco, of course, the Wrangler's already here. They've been just hits when they go electric or will go electric. Is this going to be the first one that just doesn't quite land with customers? I don't know. We'll see.
I will say I do think they actually are on the right track as far as branding.
Yeah.
Because Scout is far and away the most popular International Harvester kind of model. And there are a number of other complications, like if they were to bring back the IH brand. One of them being that I think IH ended up being merged into Case Tractors. So I don't know if there would be any kind of trademark issues there. And gosh, I can't remember. Do you guys remember if the international truck line, the commercial trucks, is that under the Volkswagen umbrella? I can't remember for sure.
I believe it's its own brand, actually. So,
okay, yeah, because I can't remember if it was part of VW or if it became part, because Freightliner is part of Mercedes.
right.
Anyway, whether or not it's part of Volkswagen, using any kind of international harvester branding, I think would add some complication of either you'd have people thinking of tractors or you'd have people thinking of commercial trucks.
Yeah.
And I don't think that would go over great. And I really don't think Volkswagen could really sell it as a VW Scout, because that would just be such a bizarre mashup of branding. I mean, and because like Scout people, I don't necessarily think are VW people, and I don't think VW people are necessarily Scout people. There's probably some crossover there, but I mean, like even with the Bronco, Ford has downplayed like the Ford badging on their Broncos. Like they've kind of been moving that into sort of almost a different brand.
Yeah, heritage.
Yeah. So I think going with Scout as its own brand is the smart move. And they can always bring back other IH models like Travelall and things. Just call it like a Scout Travelall. And I think that would probably work pretty well.
And it would be a wagon, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
tall wagon.
A tall wagon. I mean, hey, that's a lot of things right now in the segment. Tall wagons. So cool. I never thought we'd be talking about the Scout on a podcast or writing about it in 2022, but hey, that's kind of cool. Something that also has been dormant for a while is the Tesla Semi. To get one, you need to put down $20,000. That is the deposit to save your spot. There's a couple of different versions of it. One is 500 miles. That's actually the more expensive one. Then there's one for 300 miles. You're looking at $150,000 and $180,000 as far as the prices. They haven't really mentioned exactly really anything else about it other than throwing out a pretty cool looking picture, very futuristic. Perhaps how Optimus Prime might have evolved into this modern world. I don't know if he went electric, but this is like one of the many parts of like the sprawling empire that is Tesla that you almost tend to forget about. You know, it's like Cybertruck. Oh, hey, what about the Roadster? The Semi. The Semi was the biggest deal for like a minute. So I'm curious, what do you guys think?
Well, it's an interesting space. I mean, you know, Tesla being Tesla, commercial is not really their big thing when it comes to, you know, four-wheeled transportation. SpaceX is all commercial, but they're going to space. That's a whole different thing. So it's an interesting move. I'm actually kind of surprised we haven't seen Tesla and other automakers, quote unquote, again, legacy automakers, pushing EV commercial type stuff into kind of its own sub-brand. GM's kind of doing that with the Bright Drop thing, which to a degree makes sense. I don't know like what their relationship is with their corporate entities, whether any of that actually matters or not, but it's interesting. And the way automakers have been kind of eager to segregate EV and non-EV to try and make the business units separate and keep their books separate so they can say, hey, look, see, we're investing tons of money in EV and we're not just relying on ICE to pay the bills. Like there's so much of that happening, and I'm surprised that Tesla hasn't taken kind of a similar route with the Semi. Like, you know, why keep it a Tesla? It's not meant to be like a retail product for individuals. I'm sure plenty of Tesla fans would love to own a Tesla Semi just to say they do, but it's not who they're going for with this. I'm surprised we haven't seen something like, you know, like a quote unquote Blue Oval brand or something like that to just be Ford commercial vehicles, for example, because you could spin it off. You know, it would just be an entirely separate sub brand, the way they're doing with the Icons, with the Broncos, with the Mustangs, which even Mach-E falls under that. So good tie into what we were just talking about with Scout. Like there are upsides and downsides of doing that kind of thing. It's the Tesla Semi to me just, it doesn't really make any sense. It's more of like a proof of concept and we don't even really have the proof yet. So I don't know. It's $20,000 to finance whatever Tesla's building right now, which is fundamentally like decade-old platforms that have been shrunk. So, you know, not impressed personally.
I mean, I think Tesla just has missed their window of opportunity here. Freightliner and Volvo already sell electric semi-trucks. If you can buy them now, they're available. You can go to the dealer and say, hey, I want these, and they've got them. And then the big three are filling in the commercial van market pretty quickly. We've got Ford Transit Electric. We've got Ram ProMaster Electric coming up soon. We've got GM's BrightDrop. I've been seeing BrightDrop vans running around here in Metro Detroit. And Rivian also has their electric vans. I just don't think Tesla. I think this is going to be a dead end for Tesla because there's going to be a market already, and it's going to be filled by companies that know how to make commercial vehicles, how to sell them, and how to provide all of the support services for those groups. I mean, some like Ford already has a whole bunch of like productivity tools and software and networks that transportation owners can utilize and can take advantage of to improve efficiency and like charging and planning out routes. This is stuff that all of the established commercial makers already offer, and honestly, a lot of people probably already take advantage of some of that stuff. I mean, looking at Ford with like the Transit, the fact that it's still going to be based on Transit means that any upfitter type stuff can just be transferred right over. And people might already be using some of Ford's tools. And I'm sure that's the same case with like Volvo semis and Freightliner semis. And like the Ram ProMaster electric van it's going to be based on like a normal ProMaster. So anything that you've got is going to work with it. And they're going to be designed by people that know how to design commercial vehicles for certain purposes. I still remember that one of our contributors, Jonathan Ramsey, his kind of going through talking about the Tesla Semi years ago when we thought it was going to come out sooner, and why he, as someone that has driven trucks before, feels like there were a whole bunch of design issues with this Tesla Semi. So I don't really see... I don't see the Tesla Semi working out well.
It's interesting because a lot of Teslas, like the mojo, the confidence they bring is their technological expertise as an electric vehicle maker, and then of course the design and the cool factor. Aside from the EV tech, that doesn't really apply to the commercial vehicle space. It, like the companies that buy semi trucks do not care how cool Tesla is to some consumers. So, at some point, if, they're looking at the different options, hey, we need to refill our fleet. What should we do? Oh, hey, there's a Tesla. This is where they are on range. This is where they are on price. They might start to factor that into their equation. But the fact that Tesla is cool, who cares, right? When you're getting your Amazon packages delivered or your Walmart or the Coke delivery truck, literally, who cares? You don't know what kind of truck that is. There may be some companies that say, hey, we do want to associate ourselves with like Teslas are what drive our goods. That could work. I mean, it definitely could. Tesla has a very, they create buzz with everything they do. But, from a very practical perspective, you don't get the same cool factor that you get from, your neighbor has a Model 3 plugged in his driveway. It's definitely a different, just apples to oranges, So, I mean, we'll see. I was thinking about this last night when I was walking my dog, looking at my neighbor with a Model 3 plugged into his driveway. And it kind of hit me about how Bollinger basically went commercial. And they needed to have that kind of order bank with, for sure, things that they were going to sell to somebody and that money coming in. It was like a structural thing on the balance sheet that keeps them healthy and gives them certainty. Tesla certainly wouldn't hurt, but they also don't need that, I mean, so to me, it's honestly a little weird that they're taking deliveries or taking deposits for this, Is it to pay for the Twitter acquisition? I don't know. I mean, it's a different move. And if and when they bring it to market, there will be a market for them for sure, I think. Wait and see. I think once we see how many hand raisers there are, I think that will be an interesting next sort of part of this story.
And I guess that's the other thing. Who are these companies that want to drop 20 grand per truck for a truck that's already been delayed years and years, and we don't know when it's actually going to come out? Why would you drop that kind of money on something like that? You don't even really know for sure when you're going to get them, if you're going to get them. I mean, how many people have been paying for full self-driving, and that's not a thing yet. And honestly, if you're running a business, like, you can't just do that and just kind of hope and pray that they're going to deliver on it. Like, you need results.
Yeah, your fleet has a schedule for replacement, and when you're due up, you're due up. You can't just be like, well, maybe in the next 5 years we'll replace our trucks. No, when you need new trucks, you need new trucks. That's it.
All right. Well, let's transition over to the Chevy Blazer SS. Hey, we were talking about Scout earlier. Let's talk about Blazer, with Tesla kind of sandwiched in between as the creamy filling of the news segment here. Chevy Blazer SS. I think this is kind of cool. I am excited to see that Chevy is sort of quietly dipped back into using SS as a moniker on some of its cars. You know, they used it somewhat widely, especially in the early 2000s. They had it on probably arguably too many things. HHRSS, anyone? Which I drove once. It was kind of crazy, actually. Then they simply had the SS that rebadged. It wasn't a G8. It was a Holden, I guess, that was rebadged as a Chevy SS. And of course, there still is the Camaro SS, which never went away. I don't know. Blazer SS takers, what do we think?
I'm excited.
Yeah?
I think the current Blazer has actually always been kind of a looker. It's just the kind of the underpinnings are not great. They're not bad, but there's nothing that gets me super excited to go drive a Blazer, except for the way it looks. I mean, I think it's actually a really good looking SUV. So I'm excited to see that kind of styling applied to an electric vehicle, and GM has shown that they can build really quite good electric cars, and they can build really great performance cars too. I mean, the Corvette and Camaro and the Cadillac Blackwings, they're all spectacular. So basically, when GM decides it wants to make a car that drives excellent, they can make a car drive better than just about anybody else. So I'm hoping that some of that dedication gets applied to this Blazer SS, since they are marketing it as a performance EV. So if they can pull that off, I think it's going to be a pretty sweet thing. Spy shots, I'm a little bit iffy on how it's going to look, but hey, it's still kind of early in those shots, so I'm not trying to judge it too harshly styling wise yet.
Yeah, they might have just decked that out to make it look as much like a current Blazer as possible, just to kind of throw off the scent when it comes to the spy photographers, though I'm not sure it really worked. But, I mean, we ran them anyway, right? But, yeah, I think it's a good move. And it's also, I mean, everybody criticized, not everybody, a lot of people criticize Ford for the whole Mustang Mach-E thing. So it's kind of nice to see Chevy going with a nameplate that at this point they've kind of already tarnished a little bit with Blazer, where it's just like, okay, that's what Blazer is now, and it's also going to be electric. That seems smart to me. Like, they've already upset those people, so it's not going to upset anybody new that they're adding an electric powertrain to this, and making it the SS. I think is a smart move. I mean, the most exciting thing about electric for a lot of people is the performance. So why not lead with that when you can? Makes sense to me.
Yeah, to me, it's interesting, not to really peel back the onion here, but I mean, they really repositioned the Blazer. It is this very sleekly styled crossover that I've said this a few times on the podcast and other places, that if they had wanted to call this design like a Camaro crossover with a few tweaks, sure, it's got a long hood, it's kind of sleek. I think you could argue it looks about as much like a Camaro as the Mach-E does look like a Mustang, given the just footprints and design cues. The Mustang Mach-E does take it a bit further, I think. They did some things with the lights and just some other design cues that do dial in. But Chevy has 85% of it there with the Blazer. I think it looks good for what it is. I'm not sure Blazer was ever really the right name for it. I think it's a strong name. It has immediate name recognition, and I think it's probably the right commercial move. But when you see the Bronco Wrangler and now the Scout coming out, perhaps saving Blazer for, their own rough and tough off-roader that was electric might have been a smart move. But I mean, who knows? We can only do make the choices with the information at hand. And that's what Chevy decided to go with a few years ago. So it's electric. To your point, Joel, when they want to make a good electric car, and to your point, Byron, when it comes to chassis work, General Motors knows what they're doing. I think this is going to be pretty good. I can't wait for the first comparison test. Mach-E versus Blazer SS. That sounds pretty good. I'd show up for that one. So.
Yeah, and I think naming-wise, I do agree. It does feel a little bit like Blazer kind of ended up in the wrong spot, but I also kind of think GM, I think, kind of cornered themselves in a number of ways with like Blazer and Trailblazer naming. Since part of it, I think, is that when the current Blazer was probably in development, I think it was at a time when people did kind of think like, the market for like body-on-frame SUVs is really shrinking. Like, that's not something that people are really looking at anymore. People are all about crossovers and things, so we'll go ahead and use this name on that. And then a few years later, off-roading and like old school SUVs just kind of exploded. Because this was also sort of like the time when like FJ Cruiser was going away, Xterra was going away. Just everybody was kind of scaling down their sort of traditional SUV lineup. But then there's just kind of this sudden reversal when Jeeps are selling like crazy. The 4Runner is having like better selling year after year, even as it keeps getting older and older, and the Bronco comes out. So I think Chevy kind of cornered themselves a little bit, right, with the Blazer crossover launch, because I think it made sense at the time, and then things suddenly changed, and now it looks kind of, it's a hindsight is 2020 kind of thing. And then, well, how do you pivot from something that is now fairly established as a crossover to something that's off-roading? And so I think they're just kind of, they're dealing with the hand that they dealt themselves. It could be worse.
I almost feel like they could have called this. Again, Blazer in my mind is like the guy who dabbles a little bit in marketing and consumer stuff and some of my like non editorial roles here. Let me put it that way. I get why they did Blazer. On the other hand, man, Caprice, Impala, like I could have seen like this design being used with a different name, as I think we've all kind of, piled on here. Let's put it that way. And then the Trailblazer is even more confusing to me. Like that's like an even more egregious sort of like misuse of a name. But again, it's a decent product. It's a name that has awareness. Sometimes you don't always try to match up the histories.
And actually, I could see a possibility for them if they did want to do like a straight up off-road SUV. You just call it K5.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think that would work out well.
GMC Jimmy.
Yeah.
Did I read somewhere there was like a rumor about a Ram Charger coming back? I don't know where I saw that. That may have been like a rendering or something, but like, I mean, yeah.
I think it was a real rumor, but the Ram Charger part might have just been editorializing.
Got it.
Either our or somebody else's part.
Yeah.
Because like the Wagoneer is kind of related to the Ram.
Yeah.
And it's built at Ram plants. And with how popular big SUVs are, you can kind of think, oh, maybe there could be a Ram Charger kind of thing. But I don't think there's than anything official or particularly or kind of like rumory coming out of executives yet there. So it's one of those things that it's very plausible, but I don't think there's anything concrete there yet.
Right. I didn't think it was concrete, but I was wondering how like rumory it was. But I mean, could you imagine if Ram or Dodge or somebody rolled out an off-roader and then like Chevy's standing there kind of like, well, we do have the Hummer over here, but it's six figures. And I mean, there's the 4Runner, VW's coming at you with a Scout. Like, to me, that would be an opportunity where GM would say, yeah, I mean, I think the K5 would be a great way to just throw it out there and make it look as cool as it can. And, I think you'd get some critical mass. I mean, the way it's going, you're going to have 3, 4, 5 old school off-road retro things with electric options in the few years that you can buy, which sounds kind of awesome, actually. So, all right, let's talk about the Cadillac Escalade. Maybe there will be a day in the future when we're talking about they should bring back the Escalade, and then we'll debate about what is it? Is it really an Escalade? Who knows? But I drove one in the present as recently as Monday, and then throughout all of last week. Headline here is it was the diesel model. This is the Duramax. I've driven the Duramax also in the Suburban. I don't think I have driven it in the Tahoe. I may have, but I've made my way through a lot of the different like variants and applications of the Duramax in different GM vehicles. I got to give them high marks for, I think, offering it as an option. I can't imagine the take rate is particularly high, especially in the Escalade, but I think it's a very smart move. It's like money on the table. You might as well go for it. In the Escalade, continues to be the Escalade would be my other approach. I think it's really strong. It's always like top, right up there with the Navigator as far as like which domestic body on frame SUV do you want? They're both very strong. They're both, in my mind, more confident and perhaps better at what they do than almost anything else out there. I would rather have an Escalade than a BMW X7. Let me put it that way. Slightly different segments, but still, I mean, if you're going to compare the flagship SUV of one brand against another, I think Cadillac still has something that's, this is perhaps the most Cadillac thing they do. It's like something that's at or near the top of the segment. It's confident. It has great design. It has a huge number of things you can do to it as far as whether you want it to be expensive or really expensive, which that says Cadillac. Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed my time in it. It got some attention, but it also had the sort of like dark trim package. So it was a little more subtle than you might expect. But impressive vehicle. I definitely think GM has, they're doing it right with the Escalade, and there's no need to do a lot of changing. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had the opportunity to be in an Escalade yet, but I've been in a number of GM's full-size SUVs. I really like them. They drive really well. I think in particular, the magnetic ride suspension is super, super good. I still kind of think that, like, both Ford and GM, their magnetic ride technology, I kind of feel like is sort of the benchmark for like ride and handling balance. Like, I haven't really found much that does better. And I think the diesel is pretty neat. I was just looking at the fuel economy ratings for it. I mean, it gets, depending on whether you've got 4-wheel drive or 2-wheel drive, it'll get 26 or 27 miles per gallon on the highway, and you're not going to do worse than 20 in the city. Like, that's impressive out of a big SUV.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, a smart move to be able to put those fuel economy numbers out there, like on their website, and let people know, hey, you can do this if you want, or you want to get the traditional V8, that's there as well. We do have a Cadillac owner on the call here, Byron. Have you driven the new Escalade? What's your take on it?
Yeah, I have. I drove it right after launch, I guess it was.
Okay.
I don't know that it might have actually been our first drive now that I think about it, because that was a COVID introduction.
Oh, right.
Yeah, well, it's funny because the diesel is basically like the sensible buyer's Escalade, but I don't know how many sensible buyers would actually want an Escalade. So
Yeah.
that's kind of, that's sort of the little canyon that it falls into, where, most of the people who would probably want the more sensible option would just go with a less expensive variant of that platform to begin with. But I mean, I've driven the Escalade and I've driven the I can't remember which of the two GM trucks with the Duramax. So I'm familiar with the powertrain, I'm familiar with the car, but I haven't put the two together yet. And I mean, yeah, it makes a ton of sense. It's for, it's for the buyer who just wants the most luxurious car for themselves, but also wants the capability for towing. I mean, apart from that, or the person who literally like gets immediately on the highway after they leave their driveway, doesn't leave it until they get to their office and only cares about highway fuel economy. And again, that just doesn't scream Escalade buyer to me. So I'm glad that it exists, and I'm sure that some of the people out there who do tow regularly are also thankful that they can get that combination, but I'm shocked it still exists. I don't see it lasting very long, especially with emissions getting tighter and tighter. So,
All right, we've slightly buried the lead here. We'll call this kind of a preview drive. Road Test editor Zach Palmer just drove the Nissan Z, the new Z car. How exciting. We're going to have him on in one of the upcoming weeks here to really break it down. But in a moment of serendipity, you have one in your driveway, Byron, which is kind of awesome. And you have put some miles on it. So there's no reason to spare our listeners like what this new Z car is all about. Some of your initial impressions. I got to imagine this is one of those things that shows up and you're pretty psyched. That must have been the case.
Yeah, absolutely. When Zach told me, like, yeah, well, the embargo breaks on Monday, we're going to have it to you that day, I was like, oh, okay, well, that's exciting. So this is a performance model with the automatic. MSRP is $53,610 with virtually no additional options. It's only what's baked into performance. It is an automatic, which is unfortunate for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it's an automatic, and second of all, because the car that I am driving is an early build. I'm not going to call it a prototype because I believe it is production spec, but it's pre-production, and the words that might describe it accurately would be basket case. It is not a sellable vehicle. The transmission's not acting great. It's a little wonky, but when you can get it to behave, which I have managed to do a few times, it is a heck of a lot of fun to drive. But you can tell that it's the same old Z underneath. Like when you open up the car and look inside, the interior layout, like, sure, they changed the dash, they changed some of the other elements, but when you look at it, you go, yeah, this is a 350Z turned 370Z turned Z. Like, it is the same car inside. That huge cross brace is still in the rear hatch area. Like, all the elements that you expect from an FMZ vehicle are there. And when you drive it, a lot of that old feel is still there. So if you're familiar with the Z platform, it's going to feel immediately obvious that it's the same vehicle. But that engine is wonderful. The twin turbo V6 is fantastic. It's got tons of punch, and it does really want to rev. That's what surprised me, I think, the most about driving this car is, like, just puttering around town. The transmission almost seems mad at you half the time because you're short shifting it so frequently. But when you can actually get out and rev that thing, when it hits probably around like 5,500 RPM, it screams, and it is a blast to drive when you can actually get out and away from traffic and have a little fun with it. So I'm super looking forward to driving one with the stick because the automatic is definitely not my deal. But so far, I'm really impressed by it.
Sounds good. I will give Nissan PR, if you're listening, I got to give you guys some credit here. Multiple times I have driven like cars from them under embargo, like in the press fleet. We actually, when I was at Auto Week, I remember very like visibly, this was 08 or 09. I'm dating myself here. They gave us a Nissan. It was the new Z back then, and it was sitting in the basement of Auto Week in the parking garage. And I was quite young at the time, and they were just like, you can drive it. Don't do anything with it. This is under embargo. It's like next week's cover car or something. Don't break it because we haven't shot it. And the thing was being like revealed at the LA Auto Show, I want to say, like a day later. So there were a lot of different things. Another moment in this job where you're like, well, this is surreal. I'm driving this car that isn't technically public yet. So that's kind of cool. But back to the present, I think they nailed it with the design. I am very much excited to get a loan of this myself. I've always liked the Z car too. I think for what it is, that just kind of like, just it's almost like Nissan's version of the Challenger, the Dodge Challenger, which maybe like that might be a bit of a hot take, but they don't try to do everything that Chevy does with the Camaro, somewhat unsuccessfully because they don't sell many of them, even though they have the most athletic car in the segment. It's not quite as ubiquitous as the Mustang. It just is what it is, which is like it or leave it. That's who they are. And I think that's great for Nissan. And it's exactly the approach Dodge brings with the Challenger. So, yeah, it sounds like you took it to a Ford event. So, hey, that's cool. Imagine you got some attention.
Got a few questions from the people there who work Mustang PR. They were quite curious as to what was going on with the Z. Of course, I didn't have much to tell them because I had driven it in about 20 minutes of rush hour traffic, so it wasn't very useful information. But yeah, I called this particular car a basket case, and I really want to stress that applies literally to this particular vehicle that was loaned to me. It's got an early build of all the infotainment software and stuff like that. It is not the same car you're going to be buying at a dealer. So take my comments with a grain of salt. It is wonderful to drive. This particular one just happens to be a little difficult to live with. That's all.
Something that I do think is kind of interesting is how Nissan seems to be doing quite well at taking kind of their old bones and revitalizing them. Because in some ways, the Nissan Z is a little bit like the Nissan Frontier in the sense that they used basically kind of the old chassis and stuff and just really overhauled most of it and have come out with something that's actually quite good. I mean, like, I really like the current Nissan Frontier, even if it's based on like the older one. I like the size. It's got the newer, fresher engine that really helps a lot, along with the transmission, which reading Zach's story, apparently the transmission between the two is between the Z and the Frontier is related. But I do think it's interesting how Nissan is kind of taking advantage of old stuff and making it new again, which actually I guess is kind of what Dodge has done with like Charger and Challenger, to Greg's point.
Yeah, a little bit of FCA Stellantis ethos, and just keep kicking the ball forward as long as it works. Keep rolling it out there and see what happens. So,
as someone who's owned a Challenger and has seriously considered on multiple occasions buying a used 370Z, I feel like these two companies they got me. So their strategy definitely works.
I am at least though relieved that Nissan is at least looking forward with its electric cars, because I would be worried if they were only revitalizing their old stuff.
Yeah.
I would say I'm impressed too with the pricing too. I thought they came in pretty aggressive with the low price, just over 41. Obviously you can option it up, but I think they came in aggressive here. And I think this is where, if you're a sports car person, you should look at the Z. I mean, it's different. It's to me, I'm very impressed with that part of it. One of you guys also wrote a column, if I'm remembering this right, that this is the Z we deserve. I think that was you, Byron, right?
Yeah.
After driving it, where do you land?
Yeah, I think it actually played out that way. And the one thing that I've noticed about it that I haven't compared notes with Zach or anything like that, and I encourage everyone to read his write-up since he's driven both transmissions and he's gotten the opportunity to drive them off public roads and all that kind of stuff. But the one thing I've noticed is you can pretty clearly tell that they had Nismo in mind with this car, because I mean the one I'm driving is a fairly loaded automatic performance model. And at 50, like we'll call it mid 50,000s, you're talking about like loaded up Mustang GT performance package 2s or even like leftover Mach 1s. Like this is the arena we're talking about here. Like this car, you can tell it's steps 1 and 2 of a 3-step formula. Like there's the basic car, there's the performance, and then there's Nismo. We just don't have the Nismo yet. So I don't know what exactly that's going to look like, but you can tell there's headroom left there for it, because this is a very it can be kind of soft and it can be very aggressive. There's no real middle point, and I feel like you need to get to Nismo to have the more fleshed out version of it, where perhaps like, they can recalibrate all of the sports settings for the chassis and everything and kind of give us just a little bit more of like a middle ground to play with, where this is kind of on off. It's either like full bore, you're just out there to have fun, or it's in super soft commuter mode. There's not a whole lot of flexibility there or customizability in the system. So it's you can tell that it's a picture that has not yet been fully painted.
All right, sounds good. Well, again, check out Zach Palmer's full review. Went up this week. It's a good read. We will have Zach on the podcast in the coming weeks, and I'll tease it out. We actually have a sports car roundtable coming up just in time for summer driving season. So you'll definitely want to make sure you have the Autoblog podcast set for automatic downloads, as I'm sure you always do. Let's move along back to electric cars here. Ioniq 5 versus EV6. You guys traded these cars a couple weeks ago, and let's just start off this way. Which one do you like better, Joel?
I definitely prefer the Kia EV6.
Okay.
And going in, I wasn't entirely sure that's how it was going to shake out. In fact, having seen both of them up close at auto shows for a few months before, I was kind of leaning toward liking the Ioniq a little bit more. It's slightly cheaper, and the Ioniq just has so many fantastic little design details all around the outside and in the inside. But after driving them, I really do prefer the EV6. I feel like they actually have surprisingly different driving characters for being mechanically almost the same. The EV6 in my driving with it was a much firmer ride, but that helped it make it feel a lot more responsive. I felt like the steering was a little bit sharper. And I actually felt like even ride quality, although it was firmer, I felt like it had better body control. It didn't feel like it was kind of floating and bouncing as much as the Ioniq. And so I really prefer the Kia by a pretty significant margin.
Byron?
Yeah, pretty much everything he just said.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, like, I mean,
Wow.
when I saw them, like the Ioniq 5 definitely has more distinctive, like, I'm an EV things going
Yeah.
on both inside and out. But I just generally like the styling of the EV6 better. I like the way the interior was laid out better. It's a bit more conventional, which, I mean, considering they're trying to sell these to people who probably have never driven an EV before, that's not a bad thing. And I just think it's generally more attractive. And it does drive a little bit better. So yeah, that's my pick too.
That's interesting. I have driven the Ioniq 5, loved it. I do like the kind of like slightly, retro futuristic 80s vibe it kind of gives you if you really want to look at it and kind of recalibrate your brain. I have not driven the EV6. Just looking at the photos, I would say the EV6 is cooler looking. It really has this kind of like almost like Speedwagon kind of vibe. But again, I haven't driven it. So that maybe what will put me over is the interior. I was kind of just okay on the Ioniq 5's interior. I know some auto journalists have loved the interior to the point where I'm almost blown away. I'm like, I drove it. It's nice. It's okay. It's not as good. Like, I always think it's funny when you drive a car and somebody else has a much more like, a hotter or cooler take on the thing than you do. So I'll reserve my judgment until then. I do like the Ioniq 5 though. Can't wait to drive the EV6. But since we're talking electric, Byron, you just moved. You moved to a place where kind of roughly half of your like structural property is your garage, which is great. Knowing you like to make sure your cars are well taken care of. And you added a charger. What was this like?
It was a breeze, honestly. It's an older house, as many of the buildings around here are. And I was going to have the wiring in the house upgraded anyway, and so I decided if I'm going to be reviewing new cars, it would be a good idea to have the ability to charge electrics at faster than 2 or 3 miles per hour. So I went with a pretty simple setup. I just went with a straight up 240 plug essentially built into a sub panel in the garage. And really, the most expensive part of the whole thing was having the wiring run between the house and the garage because they're about 12 feet apart. It's a detached situation. So it super clean. I just went with the plug. I didn't even buy a charging box or anything like that. So I have no Wi-Fi connectivity or app related stuff. But for me, for anybody who does this job where you're going to have different vehicles and, you're not necessarily going to have time to fully acclimate them to whatever your setup is, a raw plug works great. And I bought a $300 charging cable on Amazon that plugs right into the NEMA 1450. So it's a 50 amp socket, which you get 40 amp draw on it because it's limited to only 80% of the maximum capacity. But I was getting perfect. I mean, for both the Ioniq 5 and the EV6, they came to me with less than half, I think, of their charge remaining. And that's not a knock on Joel or anything like that. He just doesn't have the ability to charge them the way I do. And had them both completely topped off by that same evening with, no sweat whatsoever. I haven't gotten an electric bill to show how much it costs me to do that yet. So that'll be the last thing I get before I actually do a follow-up piece on that. So I'll do a write-up so everyone can see exactly what I did.
Pretty cool. Everybody's electric bill is terrible, especially this time of the year in Michigan when it's hot. It's also cold. It could be at any different points, even if you use like gas for different appliances. Anyways, I got to give you credit, Byron. You had your house rewired, and then like your first move was to get a car charger port. That's aggressive. I mean, I just plugged in my monitor and the outlet sparked, and we've lived here like 8 years. So not great, but I also think it's fine. I hope, fingers crossed. Probably. Yeah, it does that sometimes.
It's probably just that outlet. It shouldn't be a big deal.
Yeah, I don't think it's like the house. This house is somewhat newer. It's more like suburban, like 70s than you were working with, like what, something from the 40s, it sounds like?
1928.
1928, okay.
Yeah,
so
I still had fuse panels in the house when I moved in. So
that was...
they still exist. They're just no longer actually run in line to any of the electrical stuff in the house. But they're cool to look at. So
well, I mean, that's what is that? When you're wiring dates to the administration of Calvin Coolidge, that's time for an upgrade. Let me put it that way. All right, so there's no easy way to fade from that era of time to the Acura Integra, but road test editor Zach Palmer, who has been sort of ghostly appearing and mentioned throughout this podcast, is on location. He's going to file our latest dispatch for this week's show. Let's have a listen in.
Thanks, Greg. And hello from Austin, Texas. I'm Zach Palmer, road test editor. What am I doing in Austin? Well, I'm driving the new 2023 Acura Integra, the revival of the Integra nameplate, which I am personally very excited about. But yeah, Austin is where Acura has us out right now to experience its new 5-door hatchback for the first time. It's not exactly the first place that I would think of when it comes to the Integra and the places around the world in this country in which it's super popular. My first thought always goes to the West Coast, Los Angeles, that sort of area where the Integra is certainly loved and the culture for tuning Hondas is best. But here we are in Texas. I'm glad to be here. I literally just hopped out of the driver's seat. I was driving a 6-speed manual transmission version, the A-Spec trim, and I actually drove the CVT version of that just earlier. Now, I cannot tell you how it drives yet. That's going to wait until the embargo is up. It'll be just a few days from now, actually. May 26th is when you're going to want to come back to hear driving impressions. But I can tell you a little bit about how the car felt to, well, actually see the production version of it for the first time, get to sit in it, row through the gears, and, just give you guys an impression of what it's like to be here. For starters, it's 100 degrees outside, so that is lovely. I guess Austin, Texas gets really hot really quick. But I didn't really mind just because, like I said, I have a bit of a personal connection with this car. So I myself own a 2001 Acura Integra GSR. So being able to be one of the first people to drive it out on roads, it's a very special moment for me, and it's just really special, to see this car out there, the Integra nameplate on a brand new car in general. It makes me really happy. The Integra was my first car, and I still own it, and I really, really love that thing. So what's this new one like? Well, when I first saw it, I was like, all right, this looks just like the prototype. And yes, it pretty much does. Acura didn't do a whole lot to change between that super bright yellow prototype and what we get for the production car. Unfortunately, if you really like that yellow paint on the prototype, you cannot get it on the Integra, at least for 2023. I wouldn't doubt if Acura came out with that color in the future. But no, this is a really, really good looking hatchback. It's, I'd say it's just a little bit larger than a Civic. So as far as its stature and like how it looks parked on the road, how it feels when you're actually, seeing them drive by, they look a lot, in that compact hatchback range. Think, Audi A3, Mercedes-Benz CLA, similar size. However, Acura in their genius, it's the same with pretty much all Hondas, are able to get a lot out of a small space. So just like the Civic has a really, really huge back seat, and because it's a hatchback, it also has a pretty large cargo area. One thing I will note with that back seat, though, because of that sloping roofline, you have yourself pretty limited headroom. I know that my head was brushing up against it. But, moving back to the driver's seat, which is probably what you guys really want to hear about, you're met with a dash that, looks a whole lot like a Civic, because that's the underpinnings of this thing. You get some classic Honda infotainment system, works really nicely, nice and smooth. Nice big digital gauge cluster, which I really like. Your drive modes are right there, front and center. You have your classically great Honda 6-speed manual shifter. It looks honestly a lot like what the shifter looked like in the Acura RSX, if you guys are familiar with that. I wish that I could tell you what the 1.5 liter turbocharged 4-cylinder feels like, sounds like, drives like. But like I said, gonna have to wait until the embargo is up on that one. If you guys want a little sneak peek, though, the engine and powertrain is just like the Honda Civic Si, which we already have the first drive up for. You can go check that out. And so I think that's about all I can talk about here without getting in too much trouble from Acura. So we're going to go ahead and call it there and send it back to you, Greg. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Zach. Sounds like a lot of fun. We'll look forward to talking to you in the coming weeks about this car and, of course, more on the Nissan Z. All right, Joel and Byron, that's all the time we have this week. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoy the Autoblog podcast, that's 5 stars on Apple Podcast, Spotify, wherever you get the show. Please send us your spend my monies. We would love to spend your money. It's the summer driving season, at least we think it is. Please send those. That's podcast@autoblog.com. Happy to answer your questions or any other mailbag questions you may have. Have a great week out there, and we will see you next time.